Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And hello, welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 713th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the immense pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring David Hinton and Phong H. We are thrilled to welcome poet Jacob Bromberg here as well to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize that land acknowledgements are not a replacement for decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host, David Hinton has published numerous books of poetry and essays, and many translations of ancient Chinese poetry and philosophy. These books are all informed by an abiding interest in deep ecological thinking and exploring the wave of consciousness and landscape. Hinton's work has earned wide acclaim and many national awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Landon Translation Award, and the Pan American Translation Award. Most recently, Hinton received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And artist, writer, and independent curator Phong H. is a publisher and artistic director of the Brooklyn Rail, the River Rail, Rail Editions, and Rail curatorial projects. Among many other awards, Bowie received the Dorothea and Leo Rabkin Prize for Arts Writers in 2017, was the recipient of an honorary doctorate from the University of the Arts in 2020, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award for Distinguished Service to the Arts in 2021. And without further ado, I'm so thrilled to pass it over to Phong to kick us off today.
Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you so much. With that introduction, what David has done and go along with it, I think we can just quit what we do and go live quietly in the country, contemplate the grandeur of nature. But no, we're not there, that point yet in our lives. It is a pleasure for me. I would definitely say that, partly because I've been followed David's work for a long time, and I remember reading the wonderful conversation that you had, David, with our mutual friend, the visionary painter Bill Jensen, which the Rail had the privilege to publish in the May issue 2016. And I remember there were a few epiphanies you had encountered while you were in college. I remember that essentially directed you to this lifelong commitment to understanding through your writing, through your translation of ancient Chinese culture. First, it was sea and raindrops hitting on top of surface of black pools of water that ignite light, followed by circle expanding and then disappearing before another raindrop hit the pool, which resonated with what you were reading of the Tao Te Ching, the ancient Zen Buddhist text at the time, same time, I think. The second epiphany was having grown up in Utah, where you experience huge mountains and skies, and that immensity of space somehow generated a similar thinking that can relate to ancient Chinese insight and art. And the last epiphany was having discovered Gary Snyder, whose work offers deep ecological thinking that suffuses the art of ancient China, have an impact on your early formation. So before we get to talk about the new book, which I have in my hands here, I read it with great pleasure the last 2 nights, Why Wind, Why Earth, Outplayed in 6 Extinction, published this year by Samhala Publication. I'd like to ask you maybe just a few questions in regard how it all began again. Buddhism, as we know it. Just so that you know, I was born as a Buddhist practitioner in Vietnam, born in Hue actually, the imperial city of Vietnam, where the Tet Offensive took place in '68. Buddhism, as we know it, first came to the US when Chinese immigrants arrived in mid-19th century. Many were fleeing from the Opium Wars, ravaging China, I think, and also the discovery of gold in California in the 1840s certainly created a boom economy that needed workers. We all remember that. So the first Buddhist temple in Western Hemisphere, and particularly the first outside Asia, was built by the Chinese community in San Francisco in that same time, maybe a little bit 10 years later. But then by 1880s, Japanese immigrants began coming west also. So by 1930s, most of the other Buddhist schools of Japan has also built at least one temple in North America to serve the growing Japanese American population. Slowly, non-Asian Westerner took an interest in Buddhism. There was European scholar living in British colony in Asia who were producing English translation of Asian sacred texts, including Buddhist Sutra, which turned out to be significant thinking of transcendentalist philosophers, influenced them in a way. We know, having read Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, among others, particularly my favorite, the Dial magazine, Margaret Fuller, among others. But very few writers and translators did more to bring Buddhism to the West than Suzuki, for example, who have studied European and Asian language at Tokyo University. I read Kay Lawson's excellent book recently also, beginning in the 20s and 30s, David. You know, his book translation lectures for sure introduce Buddhism, especially Japanese Jains and Pure Land, to a vast audience of non-Asian Western readers, including writers that we admire, Alan Watts, and the big generation author like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac. Their popular and widely read books make sense a household word in the 50s and the 60s. My first question is this: did you think books of, let's say, Gary Schneider, you admire, you know, particularly Rip Raff and Cold Mountain Poem, that was published super early, 1959, or say Philip Whelan, The Calendar, the book of poems, which I believe he published as his undergrad thesis when he was at Reed College around 51 or so, among other authors too. Thomas Merton, you know, Robert Lax, so on. Do you think those books helped to bring greater attention to Eastern philosophy in the decade of 50 leading to the 60s?
Wow, you know so much, Phong. Jesus. Oh yeah, well, it was Suzuki and Watts who really introduced Zen, I think, to the Western world really in the 50s. Suzuki started publishing books, I think, in the 30s, but they really took hold in the 50s and 60s. And it wasn't necessarily sort of deep Chan writing, although I think Watts was quite good. Even still, he stands up quite well. But, you know, the thing that they really loved about it was just the paradox and the wildness of it. And that's what resonated with the 50s and 60s, which was all about personal liberation and sexual liberation and all on and on. So it was, that's where it sort of stayed. And that's what I'm trying to get beyond in my work, is trying to get back to the depths of the original Chan, which, like I talk about in some books, all the translations of the original Zen, the original Chan texts are pretty badly mistranslated because no one understood the concepts. They were just going for that kind of famous Zen perplexity. If you read Watts and Suzuki, you just see them over and over. The books almost become this kind of collage of little perplexing Zen stories, but they don't ever like dig into, well, what's interesting about this all of this paradox?
Yeah, I mean, I knew that Suzuki taught at Columbia University. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
that's where John Cage got turned on,
right,
listening to his lectures. Yeah.
right, exactly. So, I mean, how do you think with the Eastern philosophy?
I think Agnes Martin was at some of those too, if I'm not mistaken.
It certainly was, absolutely. And what I discovered, even when we were creating the special issue of Art Reinhardt, that was 2013, in the midst of our show, Come Together, Surviving Sandy, was that Thomas Merton was very close friend with the Buddhist monk, famous Buddhist monk who died this year, Thiek Thinh Phak, you know?
Uh-huh.
So interesting. But let me ask you this, though.
I love Reinhardt's paintings. I feel like I'm like those black paintings. That's like, I look at those and it's like the very bottom of meditation. They're incredible, and they're so informed by a pretty deep intuitive understanding of the East. And I mean, he explicitly talks about it a lot too.
Well, it's true, but because it was a time when Thomas Merton basically create his silence for a few years as a philosophical discipline. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Silence had a lot to do with Reinhardt, black painting for sure. But what do you think? How did you think whether Eastern philosophy might have had that impact in terms of how things came together during that time among the different protests, David, like from civil rights movement to the anti-war in Vietnam, and then not to mention women's liberation movement during the 60s?
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it's the reason it resonated with that is simply the idea of liberation in all of those forms. It's all, and also there was a lot of talk, especially like in the anti-war movement, about the cause of this, insane war in Vietnam is this kind of imperial Western self. And male self, and that's the same for feminism and for civil rights. It was all about this imperial Western male kind of spirit center. And so Zen is all about dismantling that. And like I said, Suzuki and Watts, a lot of their books are it's just the paradox. It's just the breaking down of that imperial self. And that's kind of what I talk about in this new book. Because that's what I see as and I probably learned it from some of these sources you're talking about back in the 60s and 70s, is that the most fundamental cause of the environmental problem is that sense of this Western self that's completely detached from the world. It's actually almost made of different stuff because it's spirit stuff as opposed to matter. It's heavenly, not earthly. And that enables this kind of radically instrumental and exploitative relation to the land. Yeah. So it's all this stuff it grows out of the 50s and 60s. It's great that you make that connection. Well, so this book is all about, primal culture, kind of the philosophical assumptions that in primal culture and in Chan Buddhism and Taoism are all about reweaving that kind of imperial self that we all kind of live with back into land and the cosmos. And then that's really the deep body, the deep transformation that has to happen before we change how we engage with the natural world, the non-human world. It's a little bit like earlier you were talking about, we need to make technology warm. Well, the way you make it give warmth to technology is deploying it with this assumption that this is all about kinship between different humans, but also the different nationalities and races, but also between humans and the natural and the non-human, and the animals and forests and oceans and et cetera, et cetera.
It's not to say that there hasn't been that kind of thinking in Western tradition, occasionally we had glimpse of it. I mean, if
Yeah.
you go back further, as early as the Roman period, Roman household was famous for depicting in their mural, scene of idyllic, sacred landscape, very, very, peaceful, because Roman was a very loud, populated human environment,
Right.
so these are scenes that were made, allow them to escape from that kind of noisiness of urban life. So it's not that it hasn't. The same thing can be said occasionally we see glimpses of, I don't know, I was thinking about Bruegel, for example, the hunt scene, that whole series where he would go up to the height of the mountain and looking down and make this wonderful, incredible animistic view depiction. I mean, I sometimes look at Bruegel and I see the same kinship with the Shu Taoning, for example, there are relationships, no more, no less than when I look at Van Gogh, I think Van Gogh and Pollock maybe come close to Eastern thinking,
Yeah.
But do you think, David, was there a fruitful relationship before? I would love to, for you to show us an example image that you picked that might illustrate that what we're talking about. But before that, do you think, was there a fruitful relationship between the world poetry, as we've been talking about, inspired by Eastern philosophy, and the popular consciousness of the environment? For example, sparked by the legendary book Rachel Carson, 1962, Silent Spring, which was the first, we all consider a marker at the beginning of modern American environment movement.
Mm-hmm. Do I think poetry had much impact on that?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things, just to bounce back to all the way to the beginning of the things you're talking about, in the West, there's very little landscape painting until something like 18th or 19th century, and then there wasn't a whole lot.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an amazing thing about Western assumptions, that there's this assumption that it's all about the human, it's all about the human and God. So Western paintings are generally sort of Christian, or they're still lives, but they're all human-centered.
Mm-hmm.
Quite different from the Chinese, and we can look at that in a second, where landscape painting is the major dominant way of painting. But in the West, and the reason there weren't paintings like that is, in the West, the sort of wild landscape was considered this kind of horrendous thing. We now assume that sort of nature, quote unquote, is sustaining and spiritually enlightening and desirable, but that only began a couple hundred years ago. And one of the things that started it, by the way, just to jump all the way back to Rome, was the rediscovery of Lucretius, a Roman poet, and that was lost in all of sort of most of Roman and Greek philosophy had been sort of destroyed by Christianity. But this Lucretius was discovered in a monastery in early 15th century, and he's like completely modern. It's all about there's no God. We're kindred with the world, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a poem that poem sort of ignites the Enlightenment, and then one of the sort of influential things that happens is the British Romantics, and they, as poets, they're discovering the wonder, or people use the word sublime. How sublime nature is, like Mont Blanc and the Alps and the Lake District in England. And this is a complete revolution in attitudes toward nature, the relation of human and nature, which had been completely hostile. Nature is just this thing to be tamed and cultivated and brought into God's realm. Now suddenly, it's the sustaining thing. It's the antidote to industrialism and commercialism and cities. And then that goes to Thoreau,
Mm-hmm.
and Thoreau goes to sort of and to Whitman, and they go to John Muir, and they go to Robinson Jeffers. So I really think poetry is like this driving underground force. Goes to Jeffers, and then from Jeffers, it starts blossoming out into the modern environmental movement, with Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson, and on and on. So yeah, I think poetry, and then I think Snyder's poetry, and Rex Roth a little less, but Snyder was a huge influence. But again, it's a little underground. It's not like millions of people are reading Snyder, but Snyder is shaping the world for people like Rachel Carson, who's going to write more popular books, and other writers.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense?
It does make sense, because poetry is the most uncompromised rendering of concentrated use of language.
Yeah, exactly.
And therefore it has the greatest inner freedom.
Yeah.
All the discipline.
Yeah, and the most probing kind of philosophical possibility. That's why, it's in poems of Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley that this happens.
Yeah.
These very concentrated little poems, and millions of people don't read Wordsworth, but Wordsworth generated John Burroughs, for instance, in the early 20th century, a sort of nature writer who was wildly popular and part of changing consciousness. John Muir, who he's helped start the Sierra Club, and he was influential politically in advocating. President Roosevelt actually went to the Sierras and hung out with John Muir, and that was the beginning of sort of national parks and wilderness areas and the whole thing. So it's beautiful the way it all sort of spreads.
Absolutely.
Almost underground, and a lot of times you can't really trace that spreading. It happens because somebody heard something at a cafe table, and then it was something Snyder said, and then it got changed, and then it gets passed along that way.
Yeah, being a poet is a very dangerous prospect.
Yeah.
Indeed. Stalin had to put Anna Akhmatova and Boris Pasternak in house arrest.
Yeah.
We know that the whole tradition goes further back.
Yep.
Sure, but can you now show us the pleasure of these images that we kind of asked David to create for us? So we're going to sit back and have David walk through this amazing selection. Thank you.
Okay, this is just a long series of almost random images that we'll just talk through. And now Phong is just like leaving it to me. I had thought that this got started fast. I wanted to say first, many thanks to the Rail, and it's a privilege to be here in the midst of the Rail's energy vortex. Yeah, and I think now like Phong turns it over and wants a long answer from me. I always think of Lao Tzu saying, "Those who know don't speak, and those who speak don't know." And John Cage saying the last thing he wants to do is push ideas from his head into other people's head. So anyway, here's some pictures. This is the image that I wrote a book called Existence, a Story about. The whole book is sort of digging into the philosophical layers of this. But to make it easy, you can just look at that and see, oh, this is a typical Chinese painting. It's all about landscape. It's all about sort of empty mind emptied of that self that I was talking about. That's the root of that of our instrumental and exploitative relationship. Well, here is a painting of minds emptied of that self. And you can see it in two ways. One is where the character that's just looking out into the mountains is supposed to sort of model that. He's someone looking out with an empty mind. In Chinese, when they spoke of empty mind, it also meant a mirror mind where there's no self left. So mind becomes a kind of mirror. Whatever you're looking at sort of becomes the content of consciousness. And that's one way the ancient Chinese wove consciousness into landscape, that idea of an empty mind, mirror mind, empty mind mirroring the world around it. And then we also see it in all the emptiness in here. When there were landscape paintings in the West, I mentioned that, and I just think it's kind of an amazing fact that of how alienated the West was. This, fabulous world all around us, just unbelievably beautiful and perceptually complex and rich. But Western painting did not think that was worthy of sort of the sacred space of painting until the 18th or 19th century, and then only for a short time. And it wasn't like, it still didn't become mainstream painting exactly. And in the 20th century, it kind of fell out again. It became abstraction and surrealism and all the other things. But what I was saying was, in a Western landscape painting, everything would be covered with thick oil. Everything would be modeled and given a more or less realistic look. Whereas if you look at this, there's an awful lot of completely empty space here. No, it's not really meant to be a realistic depiction. Mountains don't ever look like that. The people do, and some of the branches and that little knoll is a little bit realistic. But there's no attempt. There's the painting, the emptiness here is all sky and mist, sort of, and it almost, so there's this emptiness, which is when you're looking at it with an empty mirror mind, that emptiness gets mapped onto the mind. So it's the emptiness of the mind. It's also the emptiness from which those mountains seem to be emerging. So for the Chinese, this, not to get into a lot of the philosophy, but for the Chinese, this is almost seeing a painting of the emergence of mountains from the kind of cosmological source. And they're kind of hovering there, almost ready to vanish back into that emptiness. And then so here, these are old, there's this one and the next one, which are early Neolithic urn pottery from China, which show a kind of sense of that kind of dynamic force and sort of swirling around emptiness as the generative. There's another one that's pretty spectacular. Okay. These two are in the Met there in New York. Mm-hmm. Oh, keep going. Yeah, a couple of dragon paintings and one more, I think. Dragon was, here's an interesting one. The dragon was sort of the mythological image of the Chinese, for the Chinese, that emergence out of emptiness. Mm-hmm. That was the begin, that's transformation. For the Taoists, the reality is all change and transformation. Things emerge out of emptiness, evolve through their lives, and then disappear back into emptiness. So it's all change and transformation. And the dragon is the sort of the image of change and transformation. It's kind of scary because it means, you get sick, you die. There's all the bad stuff, but there's all the, there's all the wonderful, there's spring, the burgeoning forth, and there's summer, the flourishing, but then there's the autumn. So dragon is sort of awesome and wondrous, but also kind of terrifying. But notice something in this painting. This is from the, I can't remember, 14th maybe century, mm-hmm. that you have an image of the dragon, and it's not just one way of that ancient Chinese wanted to weave themselves back into the texture of the cosmos. This process of transformation was to act as a cosmos, to act with spontaneous and selfless energy. And you'll notice here, even though most of this painting is sort of traditional, painting of forms of the dragon and the mountains, but you'll notice on the left, there's just ink thrown all over the place. And so that's like an artist acting with the kind of spontaneity that's kind of recognizable to us. I think the next painting is Jackson Pollock, is it? Yeah. Oh. So it's the same, it's exactly the same as Jackson Pollock. Pollock says, I'm not painting nature, I am nature. And that's what he means. He's moving with the energy of the cosmos. And that was a big thing in ancient China too. It's remarkable, the parallels. Let's keep going. Amazing. What do we see next? Oh yeah, well, here's Phong mentioned. Yeah, this one. This is Bill Jensen, who Phong mentioned, a big friend of the rail. This is, to me, a painting of that energy, that seething energy of the cosmos driving transformation.
Yeah.
Um,
Super fierce painting. Yikes.
yeah, really. This is one of my favorites of his paintings. And what's next? Yeah, back to this. Okay, go ahead. Oh, I was just showing more landscape paintings, examples of them, of the way that that landscape is infused with emptiness. Here, emptiness is mist, it's sky. It's also in the bottom left is a lake and water running into the lake. And interestingly, it's also a lot of the actual landscape forms are infused with emptiness too. So there's not a strict distinction between emptiness and presence. They're kind of interfused. And I think there are a few more examples of this we can just look through. Yeah, more emptiness. It's kind of amazing here that brushstrokes are used. This one is kind of combines that idea of spontaneous brushstrokes like Pollock's doing, or other gestural abstractionists were doing in the middle 20th century. And here we usually use those. Traditionally, you would use those brushstrokes to create an illusion of reality, illusion of space and form. And here, those brushstrokes call so much attention to themselves that you start just noticing that gestural energy, and then the scene that they seem to be representing starts breaking apart into emptiness, because you can see so clearly it's just brushstrokes, just the energy of brushstrokes. Anyway, go ahead. Another one that's almost all emptiness. This is in the Met. Keep going. Oh yeah, and this is a big, awesome one in the Taipei Palace Museum. That's here. It's less emptiness than just this majestic kind of, just the majestic booming presence of reality, I think is what this is about. I mean, it has some emptiness in it and that mist coming up. And I think there are some close-ups of this. Let's look at those.
Wow.
And more emptiness. And then also, if you notice on the right of that hillock in the front, you can barely tell there's a kind of monastery. So sort of Chan Buddhism completely embedded in landscape, and so embedded you almost don't notice it as separate from the trees. And generally in Chinese paintings, if there are human elements, they're very small, completely integrated into landscape. So here you can see a few people and traveling through with sort of pack mules, I think.
I mean, I bet you artists like Hercules Sagers, contemporary of Rembrandt, have these images for sure.
Could have seen them, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Here's a close-up of a tree root, and here you can see how calligraphic Chinese painting is, because you can see these lines and how they're made like calligraphy lines, a lot of kind of dynamic energy. I remember being in the Palace Museum when I lived there in Taipei, in Taiwan, and there were scholars, when this painting was up, it's rarely up, and people had come from Japan to see it. And they had little stools, they just parked in front of it with binoculars, and they were studying it like inch by inch to look at this kind of, the virtuosity that goes on in these paintings, just inch by inch.
Wow.
What's next? Okay, more, I think, well, just some more, keep going. Yeah, there's another version of a Chinese painting, all emptiness. There's another one, beautiful detail of a long scroll. And this is one of my favorites in the Met, this mountain that just seems seething with that dynamic energy of the cosmos. They describe it as a dragon just lifting off into the winds.
Beautiful.
I think there's a close-up of that. Yeah, you can really feel that energy.
Oh yeah.
It's all about the cosmos as this living, dynamic energy that's just energy or tissue driven by kind of cosmological energy.
Wonderful.
And here's calligraphy. You can see how, look at the, go to the next one for a second. So here's what the text, the actual text is. And you can see how these characters are very organized. They each fit into a little square. It's very clear. The elements are very clear. Now back up one to that. Now this is that same text, and you can see how that sort of dynamic, spontaneous energy acting as the cosmos has completely transformed those. So now the characters are emerging out of space and dissolving into space, which is part of a kind of meditative process in which, it's part of like dissolving thoughts away into that kind of empty mind, the empty space around the characters. So and here's another really wild one. This is a wild Chan monk who used to get drunk and and dash one of these things off, and then you sort of fall asleep and wake up the next morning. This is a detail from a long scroll. Wake up the next morning and he didn't know what they said. That's the famous story about him. This is like 8th century China.
Amazing.
Again, the point is to move with the energy of the cosmos instead of careful, cerebral, self-involved calculation.
Got it.
And so you all recognize this. This is Bryce Martin painting, I don't know when, 70s or 80s or something. And he's very influenced by Chinese calligraphy and Chinese poetry. And so he's painting this with that same kind of calligraphic energy. He has a brush out on the end of like a 3-foot stick. So it's almost out of his control. I think that what's next, it's another, and then it evolves into this, which feels to me like sort of the tissue of reality. And he speaks of it that way, I think. And this is also a clear reference. This is I think it's kind of one of his breakthrough kind of series of paintings. They're pretty big paintings called the Cold Mountain series, based on Cold Mountain, the Chinese poet who Phong actually mentioned. Gary Snyder translated, and it was a kind of a became a very influential figure. And even though he's an ancient Chinese poet, he's a very influential figure in contemporary modern American poetry.
Especially after Red Pine translation.
Yeah. And here's a line of Chinese poetry, and you can see that emptiness we saw in the Chinese painting. That emptiness is here in the language. So if you look at that language, that's a line of poetry. You see all this stuff that's left out that we would need in English, just not aware, beginning autumn, night gradually long. First thing, the biggest thing, just all the grammatical stuff is gone. It's almost like these characters are emerging out of the emptiness, like the landscape emerging in those paintings. One more way in which that kind of instrumental spirit self of the West is being dismantled. And then the most, go back one, the most dramatic thing here is you'll notice that there's the verb aware. So that's perception happening. And the bottom part of that character, the second character in this line, is actually an eye, kind of like looking out. You can see that box with the 2 lines through it. It's kind of a picture of an eye and the iris. And the pupil, no, the iris. But just before that, in English, we would need a subject. But in Chinese, they didn't need the subject. So that self that we have, that's always embedded in our grammar, every time we say I, it reinforces that kind of transcendental self. It's not there in Chinese. The self is a kind of absent presence. So that's a pretty wonderful thing that I can't really do when I translate Chinese poetry. It's very frustrating.
Yeah.
One time I thought, well, what I'm going to do is start printing the I in gray instead of black. I didn't know if the publishers would go for that.
Okay.
And here's just this is like the oldest, this is an oracle bone, the oldest surviving form of Chinese writing. Go to the next one, you can see a close-up of it. And you can see pretty clearly the pictographic images. In the middle, you can see some like animals like horses and cows.
Yeah.
In the middle, the lowest one is a square with 2 lines across below it. That's like a child. with a body and arms, and just above it you can see a kind of cart with the box of the cart and the wheels on either side. Yeah, keep going. Keep going. I don't know why that comes back. Okay, now here's a bunch of, so I always think that the in a sense the closest thing in our time, there's there's Pollock and there's Martin and Jensen and the other gestural abstractionists do their thing, but the people who instead of people who are sort of doing landscape but inhabiting landscape rather than painting it, because as soon as you paint landscape, you've pitched it out away from you, right? You're outside of it, looking at it. And there are the land artists who are replacing landscape with just the land itself and just sort of calling attention to it. Like this is Richard Long, who I think has just got an incredibly elegant mind. That's the artwork, which will slowly dissolve, of course. It's just made by him walking back and forth in a line. And over time that will disappear and there will be nothing but the landscape again. So it's this very empty mind, weaving into landscape. So you can keep going. There's going to be a few more of these. Richard Long. There's one. It takes long hikes, weeks-long hikes, and an artwork is standing up stones, making a kind of shrine, and then he photographs it like this, and then he'll kick them all over so they don't exist anymore. Another one, snowballs, so they're not going to last long. That piece of art is going to last a few hours. Another one, I think that's off the New England or northwest coast of off Olympic Peninsula.
Amazing.
Annie Goldsworthy, a place in France that I go a lot, in southern France, and that's just sort of one of his classic forms in a wall of clay. Keep going. Another one, that's upstate, up the Hudson at Storm King, up from New York. So that's and here's another one, super ephemeral. This is in France, southern France, and he was working on a bunch of landscape art in the mountains there. And here if he's out working and rain starts, he lies down like this and creates this kind of haunting image of the human, which of course will vanish pretty quickly. Either he gets up and either the rain keeps going or the ground dries. Either way, it vanishes pretty quickly. This is another European land artist, Herman de Vries, and he just, instead of saying things, he just gets completely out of the way and just lets things be what they are, and that's the art. It's an old Chan thing. He's very influenced by Asia and Chan Buddhism and Taoism. That with that mirror mind I was talking about, the real teacher, the real sage is just stuff itself, thusness. That's what Herman de Vries is all about. Just get all of our human commentary out of the way, all of our human-centered obsessions, and just let things be themselves, and that's kind of liberating. I think there are a couple more. Yeah, just instead of using pigment to make paintings, he just puts pigment up, raw pigment that he's dug out of the ground. And these are, he calls them, I forget what he calls these, points, I think. So in the mountains there in southern France, he puts a few of these points, and he sort of says the point is the least possible human intervention, human way of defining space, right? Geometrically. It's like a point establishes space around it, but it's less than say, lines and planes and all the other things that we use to define space. And here's Spiral Jetty, which, I'm not so crazy about the American land artists who are all about this kind of really violent interventions in landscape, but this is pretty beautiful and irresistible. There are a bunch of these, just a whole bunch of different images of it. This one's from his great little short film about Spiral Jetty. And it's all about sort of this elemental primal relation to self and land. Okay, this is the last one. I don't know really, I can't remember why this is here. This is Cecilia Vicuña, an artist who lives in New York, and actually she just had a show at the Guggenheim. And for me, this is one of my all-time favorite images. I think I'm going to get it on the cover of a book here in a couple of years. And just the idea of the loom as sort of a kind of archetypal version of the human making sense of things, looming meaning together. And there's a thing in ancient China, the loom of origins, this loom that's weaving out reality.
Yeah.
And there it looks like it's this very primitive loom, sort of adrift in space with sort of clouds and stars and clouds of sort of stardust. But in fact, the wondrous thing is if you look at those stripes, those lines in the lower left, this is a photograph of a puddle in Tribeca on a street corner that Cecilia stretched this loom over, and then they photographed it, and it feels like you're out in the cosmos somewhere.
Amazing. Yeah, so I think it's we should remind ourselves that, David, thank you so much for that presentation. It's so pleasurable to watch all those incredible images. I was thinking it's nice to be able to remind ourselves that the word Chan created the word Zen. And
yeah, it's the same word. It's the same character. Yeah.
Exactly. And having grown up in Vietnam, we were very conscious how tiny Vietnam was in relation to China,
Yeah.
So from the early memory, I remember my grandmother told me that it's very simple. If you have aspiration to go to communion with nature, let's say in China, you would go up to the high mountains and you walk mile and mile without seeing a human being. You just have incredible immediate natural access to nature, which you describe, and you show us that beautiful first image of the man sitting contemplating nature, and the idea was that you can go there and do so without any intervention of other human being, and then you go home. And very important to notice that to mimic, to copy nature was considered to be inferior. You're supposed to absorb the energy of nature, and you go home and you make the image according to that, being inspired by that particular moment. But you can do that in China. It's a huge country. But in Vietnam, or let's say in Japan, you go up to the high mountain, you will be thousands of people already there picnicking, so have nowhere to go. So you must internalize Zen, which is an inner thing of that discipline. I think the word Tao is so interesting, David. The wisdom of the body in relationship, in harmony with nature, along with every opposite, pairs of opposite that exists in our meditation, our relation with the world, like the light energy, the dark energy, which exists in a way, strategy for life as much as strategy for war. I think Chao Ching, the Book of Way, I don't know the way I remember reading it. It was so important to think in the context how Vietnam, as a small nation, survived in relationship with China. Do you know what I mean? So it's interesting in that relationship. And anyway, okay, let's just get to the book, because we're talking about, we can continue to talk because we have to get to the Q&A session. How did this book come about? Because I read it the last 2 nights. It seems to divide it into 2 chapters. For example, the first chapter, chapter 1, how a little poem from ancient China could save the planet, have 12 subsections, And then chapter 2, Wandering Boundless and Free, has 5 subsections. So explain to us how it came about and how it divided in such division.
Oh, well, it came about. I mean, in a sense, everything I've done has assumed that this whole Chan framework and Chinese poetry and landscape informs a deeper environmental awareness. And I finally just said, okay, I need to write the book that goes straight at that and really makes that happen, which is a little daunting because it's easy to write literature and say it matters, but as soon as you start writing it in a topical kind of sense, then you have to feel like, oh, does this have some kind of real relevance, or can it have any impact on what's going on? And then I kind of have to suspend that. But yeah, so the first chapter that has that title, the first part that has that title, How a Little Poem from Ancient China Could Save the Planet, that's supposed to be half serious, half facetious. But the idea is the same as the landscape painting we were just looking at, is the idea that, I'm going to read the poem to you, and then you can see what I'm talking about. So this is the poem, and it comes back in the book over and over. And it's from 9th century China. It's called Egrets. Robes of snow, crests of snow, and beaks of azure jade, they fish in shadowy streams. Then startling away into flight, they leave emerald mountains for lit distances. Pear blossoms, a treeful, tumble in the evening wind. So it's just pure image. I mean, I could almost have called this chapter how a little landscape painting from ancient China could save the planet, because they work the same way. And it's the idea that this poem is all about that selfless mirroring in which we realize we're not radically separate from everything else. And that kind of dismantles that instrumental exploitative relationship. And then, I mean, the great thing about that poem is how it describes, for 3 lines, it describes the egrets. And then suddenly out of nowhere, the egrets fly away. And then suddenly out of nowhere, there's just this image of something completely different, pear blossoms. Mm-hmm. So it's just about clarity of perception. And there's the kind of paradox. There's no logical relation there, right? The poem has no argument, no development from A to B to C that you can follow. It's just this one event, the whole egret thing, and then suddenly this thing, which could be somewhere else on the planet, suddenly pear blossoms falling. Yeah. So that's sort of part 1, and then part 2 is about facing, I don't know how much I can really go explain this, about facing the fact that, like I was saying, probably nothing's going to stop this. Mm-hmm. And if you are completely integrated into the natural process, then you belong to it, you're completely kindred to it, and wherever it goes, you sort of go with it. I'm not describing this very well. Let me put it this way. Another way of thinking about a relation to the cosmos in a more clear way is a very scientific one. The cosmos evolved the sun and the planet. The planet evolved life forms. Life forms evolved image-forming eyes like ours. Mm-hmm. So when we look at that mountain or look at those egrets or look at anything, we are quite literally the cosmos looking at itself. So then you've slipped right past that whole detached self thing. And if we talk about the cosmos like we are right now, we think about it or we feel it, like we grieve because the 6th extinction is probably unstoppable. It's the cosmos thinking about itself. It's the cosmos grieving itself, quite literally. Mm-hmm. So then you can start thinking about the 6th extinction a little differently and think about it as a completely natural act. I mean, right now, everyone talks about the destruction of diversity, but this this is the sixth extinction. There have already been 5 other ones. This little slice of diversity that we know is only one moment in the evolution of Earth history and the history of the evolution of life on Earth. And there's no real reason to value that any more than any other slice of diversity, any other constellation of diversity. So then you start seeing the sixth extinction like the cosmos sees it. And it just looks like one more transformation. And the human, and if we are just a completely natural part of the cosmos, one more animal, we're us inflicting the sixth extinction on the planet isn't fundamentally different than an asteroid or volcanoes or gamma ray bursts that have created the others. So I want the book to go into that really dark place, and then hopefully I come out, I find a way past that, and that I'll leave to anybody who wants to read the book, I guess.
Which brings up to the question, a very important one, I think, which is the notion of, Wu Wei, David.
Yeah.
Wu Wei is an act of doing nothing, the so-called non-doing, not forcing things, I remember, super important, when reading the book of Wei, again, somehow Vietnam or Vietnamese people has to be constantly being aware, mindful of being constantly invaded. The Chinese was there for 1,000 years, and then it was a friend, and the Japanese was there, the American was there. Constantly, it's always, we had to be agile, thinking on our feet. So the book of Wei was super important. I mean, I was asked to memorize them as a kid. But the point is that the notion of Wu Wei is so important. For example, if I can remember exactly, there's a passage in regarding to war. It goes, man, when he enters into life, is tender and weak. And when he dies, then he is tough and strong. That is why the tough and strong are companions of death, and the tender and the weak, companions of life. For this reason, if the weapons are strong, we will never be victorious.
That's beautiful.
So it's that whole idea, right, David? Holding darknesses. I just want to show you, this is a painting by Peter Atchison. You see, okay?
Yeah.
It's almost equivalent as an attempt to what you were showing to us early on, Well, this is terrific. It's been a pleasure. I think we might be, why don't we tune it to go back to Eleanor for Q&A, shall we?
That's great.
Thank you so much, Phong and David, for this incredibly rich conversation. It's been so lovely. Our first question today will be from our friend GE. GE, you should be able to answer your question.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Thank you, Phong, and thank you, David. And thank you, David, for so many years of wonderful translations, which have just been such a bridge for me. I thank you.
Oh, thank you.
The question is, I often move from east to west and west to east when I approach various subjects. And listening in today, I was thinking a lot about your new book, which I did read an excerpt of. I was thinking of Bertrand de Born coming forward in Canto 28 of Dante's Inferno, carrying his head because he wrote poetry promoting war. And he says, because I severed those who joined, I carry, alas, my brain dissevered from its source, which is within my trunk. And thus in me, one sees the law of the counter penalty. And would you agree in any way that this is in agreement with your book's theme and of locating our current spiritual and philosophical problems?
Well, I guess so. Yeah. I'd forgotten about that. Now that's a good connection. You know, Dante actually appears in this book of mine because one of the things that really strikes me, I don't have a lot of patience for the Western intellectual or literary tradition. Really, nothing's useful to me until Wordsworth. It's only after that. And the thing that strikes me so much about Dante is it begins with him saying, being lost in the dark wood. And I write, and then he's lost in the dark wood, and his response is this massive abstract construction trying to get to heaven, which is a sublimated version of, you know, sex with his woman, which from the point of view of sort of ancient China, once you've kind of inhabited ancient Chinese poetry and philosophies, just looks completely ridiculous. And I also am struck that those dark woods that he's lost in, and that sort of leads to the whole, you know, Inferno and Purgatorio and the whole thing. Well, that's for primal cultures, that's home ground, right? That's right where they want to be. For China, the Chinese, they would like settle in and build a little house with big windows and start meditating and writing poems about egrets flying away from the mountains. It's like you just so see the radical difference between East and West right there.
Yeah.
I love what you said about Wordsworth, and even more Wordsworth. I think John Clare is really totally integrated with the landscape. But I thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that question.
Madness, right? John Clare and all of his madness. Gee, yeah.
Thank you for that question, GE. I see Mary Flynn is raising their hand, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
David, this is actually Peter Atchison. I'm sitting here with Mary, but I wonder if you would say something about your process in translation. I was thinking about what you were saying about Snyder, and I read somewhere in one of his interviews that he takes the poem in the original, does some work on the language, and then he ends up making what he calls a little movie of the driving to the point of the poem, and then writes about that movie in English, in American English. And I always thought that was a very interesting insight into translation. Could you just say a few words about your process? Do you start with the characters, or do you work it over in the English version to gain a kind of American or English language rhythm to it once the language has been brought into American English?
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty tangled process Snyder has. I'd never heard that before. Movies, okay. My process is sometimes people sometimes think it's some kind of inspired thing where you meditate and then you inhabit this poem, and then the translation kind of magically appears. But it's not. It's very pedestrian. I used to work as a stonemason, laying dry stone walls and things, and it's a lot like that. I start with the words and I just work through the words one at a time and just try to get something started, and then I just keep moving things around, trying to get them to fit together in the right way. And at some point, it starts lifting off, and then it's starting to become my poem, a contemporary American poem, and that's what I want. And then once I do that, then I'm working with the English, and it's my poem. And then I check back in with the Chinese to make sure I haven't done something I shouldn't be doing. And then I fix whatever has to get fixed. So I start going back and forth between sort of the poet's voice and my voice until the two of them are the same voice. So it's like what I want in the end is the poet speaking in my voice and me speaking in the poet's voice. And I want a contemporary American poem. I don't want, but I will say that I do keep checking in with the original. It's not like this literary spirit of the original. I really insist on keeping the elements of the original in the new one, even though I'm completely reinventing the poem completely reinventing the voice, because as you saw in that one example I showed, the language is so radically different. I have to do that. But I am, you know, keeping faith with that the original poem and all the material in it.
In his translation of one of the Cold Mountain poems, Snyder says, what's the something about silverware and cars. And in a discussion of the poem he speaks, he says, now in the original, you know, everyone knows they didn't have silverware or cars, they had carts and chopsticks. But I'm making a functional translation to address his contemporary audience. Was that something that you would be prejudiced against or towards, or you go back?
No, I don't do that. I want it to stay the Chinese poem, but as also simultaneously a contemporary American poem. So I would never do that. I almost never add an element to the poem that isn't there, virtually never. I mean, but I sort of get that argument. And I also don't tend not to translate poems if they're not going to translate well, which means they have a lot of historical reference, or they really depend on something that's just completely embedded in the culture that will require lots of notes. So no, I would be happy to leave it as carts and chopsticks if that's what it was.
Got it.
Yeah. Because that's not the stuff that matters in the poem. What matters in the poem is what's underneath it. You know, those are just the what? I don't know how to say this. Those are just the you know, the sort of the facts, the material of the poem. That's just the stuff you need to get at what's underneath it. Doesn't really matter if they're chopsticks or forks and knives.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that really great question. Our next question will be from my colleague, Chloe.
Oh, good. Okay.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for that conversation. Peter set me up so well for this question. So I am wondering how you feel your work as a translator equipped you to write this book, which I feel like, among many things, ensures that we don't lose something lost in the in-between of kind of the dual aspects of human life. And in the very beginning, you talk about that, like you talk about this inherent sort of miraculous joy and connection that we feel to living things, and how it doesn't quite make sense in the way that we relate to the world overall. And so I wonder if you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, translation was the beginning for me. That's where I sort of, by inhabiting the minds of these poets and philosophers, that's how I sort of inhabit this other worldview, and begin to see a world, really radically different possibilities from the West. So I did, translations, and then at some point I began translating just to make contemporary poems. I slowly became more interested in the philosophical framework that's informing the poems, and then I started writing prose books, one after another. Like Hunger Mountain, my first prose book was about walking up a mountain, but trying to see it the way ancient Chinese see the mountain and the world around it and the cosmos. And then it's just, so from there, it's just eventually I get to the point that I want to make that politically relevant. I've always thought the relevance was there, implied, but at some point I just decided, well, implied isn't enough. Now I want to do it directly and really dig into it, and also be willing to show the promise of this other way of seeing the world, but also realizing, it's probably not gonna happen. It's not gonna transform society. Here's this culture threatened by sort of white nationalist Christian ideology and theology. Are we going to really turn it into a kind of primal hunter-gatherer, Chan Buddhist culture, probably not. But then, so then part two is like, okay, well, if not, if we understand this, how can we live through this sixth extinction? How can we face it in a kind of beautiful, almost celebratory way? Not, you know, total grief, but also kind of liberation. You can find a kind of liberation in it, not to ever leave behind the grief or the fact that we want to stop it. Thanks for the question.
Thanks for that answer.
I like all the gold leaves behind you.
So much, Chloe. Oh, Phong, go ahead.
Is there more question, or can I ask one last one?
We have a couple more questions.
Oh, let it go. Yes, please.
Yeah, our next question will be from Amanda Pelham. Amanda, you should be able to unmute if you would like to ask directly. I'll give a moment just in case. Okay, I'll ask Amanda's question on their behalf. Amanda asked, do you have any thoughts on Native American culture, its history of a mindset of partnership with nature, and the world moving into a partnership paradigm versus a dominance/control paradigm?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do. It's one of the strands of thought in this book, Wild Mind, Wild Earth, is the amazing. I was saying how traditionally in the West, you know, nature, quote unquote, was seen as like William Bradford when he was arriving off the New England coast on the Mayflower, looked out and he wrote in his journal that he was looking out at this horrifying wasteland full of wild beasts and wild men, wild being a derogatory term. And I was saying how that transformation happened with, thanks to in part to Lucretius and then sort of Wordsworth and the Romantic poets. Well, the amazing thing is that happened largely because of, with Wordsworth and the people in his sort of era, Rousseau in France, because people were coming to North America and they were sending back to Europe or travel logs about traveling among Native Americans and talking about how harmoniously they live with the natural world. And also books that were discussions with Native American elders and sort of elders/philosophers, kind of debates between their Christian worldview and then the worldview of the Native Americans. And those books were being published in Europe too. And they were wildly popular. And those books were read by Wordsworth and Coleridge and Shelley, who were generating this whole new idea that the natural world is sustaining, that what we want is to inhabit it sort of peacefully as an antidote to, you know, Western civilization, the industrial age, the cities, commercialism. And then, like I said, from Wordsworth, it goes to Thoreau, goes to Muir, goes to Jeffers, goes to John Burroughs, goes to Rachel Carson, and the modern environmental movement. So it's kind of wonderful to think that this whole environmental movement and this whole attitude toward the natural world that we take for granted, and that is fighting against the sixth extinction, that all came from Native America, Native American culture. I mean, just directly came from there. You can just trace that movement like I did. It's kind of wondrous for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. That was a really fantastic question. I would like to ask you a question, David.
Okay.
I'm wondering how you balance the notion of the sixth extinction as, you know, being part of a larger process of evolution on Earth with our, or specifically Western culture's role in our current environmental crisis.
Yeah, it's like, how do you accept it without accepting it? Sort of. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's the dance of part 2 of the book. I'm not sure I can reinvent it, because yeah, it's a pretty difficult line, because on the one hand, if we really experience ourselves as woven into landscape, earth, cosmos, on the one hand, whatever we do to it, we do to ourselves, right? So it's self-destructive, quite literally. And not just, yeah, it's self-destructive, and it's something we want to stop. And it also, like I begin the book, like I think Chloe mentioned, about how we instinctivly feel this kinship with everything, even though our Western culture says we're separate from it. You know, we love it when life thrives, we grieve when life dies. And so we're feeling that all the time as a sixth extinction happens, but at the same time, if we are completely woven into it, wherever the sixth extinction goes, we go, right? We evolve. That's sort of us, our evolution too. So, you know, it's kind of a, Emerson said, great minds are minds that can hold two contradictions at the same time. And I think that's what you have to do in this case. I think at the end of the book, I say, the sixth extinction is now our great teacher, and it's teaching us that we have to be, that we are, in fact, because we grieve so much over the sixth extinction, that shows us how deeply woven into it we are. If we really were so detached from it, we wouldn't feel it. And maybe lots of people don't feel it, and that's why it's happening. But because we're woven into it at the same time, wherever it goes, we go. There will be respeciation. I mean, I talk about this. It's interesting that the fifth extinction was when an asteroid slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula and killed, I don't know what, 75 or 85% of all life within a couple of centuries. Well, after that, rapid respeciation happened. And in that from that respeciation came all mammals, and all birds, probably our most treasured kindred beings on the planet, and wonder of wonders, us. So, you know, we came out of the last extinction. What comes out of the sixth? What will come next?
Mm.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, well, maybe I can just squeeze it in before we go to
Yeah.
reading. I mean, it can go on forever, but you know, it's so incredible having this conversation with you. So obviously we are very aware of East and West way of thinking about nature and about human being, human existence. And as much as I'm trying to, I mean, I've been struggling to explain myself as much as trying to share that with my friends, you know, how the ego, the critical faculty function in the context of the Tao. I think that's so interesting now, because watching China, where China now, the mobilization of China has been laying its back since the Opium War, for sure.
Yep.
I think that we trace back to the policy of containment, just to switch to policy for a second. I mean, that's a famous policy of containment that John Cannon, with his famous telegram, sent in 1946. We don't need to fight China. We need to contain them, create diplomacy with them. In other words, in the context of now being the wisdom of the body, you know, in harmony with every pair of opposite that can be existed in relation to the world. There's time when light energy is dominant, and there's time when dark energy is dominant. It's precise cycle of life, you know? So I was thinking almost like a wrestling, you know, David, you're wrestling with the other person in a match, and you have to wait. It's an athlete, almost like an athletic contest in a way. How do you decide the moment in which you can turn that into something else, you know? So that's where we are at the moment. You know, China is patient, has been patient for a long time. And it's very precarious, the position where we are now. So the notion of Wu Wei is so fascinating, you know, and the notion of also slowness of culture is also essential. What we do is essential. Slowness of culture and make it as the counter friction against the machine, as the Thoreau proclaimed emphatically in Civil Disobedience, you know?
Right.
So I think this is good moment to bring on poetry.
Okay.
more poetry. We need more poetry. Thank you, David. Back to you, Eleanor.
Thank you, everyone, for that. That's a great discussion. And what made it great is just the sort of the Rails energy. Like I said, it's like everything's connected: culture, politics, ancient, modern. That's wonderful.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks again, Phong. That was really lovely. And now we do have a tradition of closing our community events with a poetry reading. And I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Jacob Bromberg, to the stage. Multimedia poet and translator Jacob Bromberg's work has appeared in or been exhibited at Paris Review, The Believer, and Le Monde, among other venues. He was the Brooklyn Rail's inaugural poet in transit, and his collaboration with Camille Henrot, Gross Fatigue, won the Silver Lion at the 2013 Venice Biennale. We're so lucky to have Jacob reading for us today, and I'm so honored to pass it over to you, Jacob.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for, this is such a wonderful opportunity to be finishing this wonderful discussion. And I really enjoy David's work, so it feels like a special honor to be at the end of this. The first poem that I'm going to read is actually something that I created with a number of other people, including someone who first turned me on to David's work, Aaron Peck. So I'm going to list the other people that I wrote it with to give them their due credit. Donatien Grau, Will Heinrich, David Horvitz, Sarah Riviere, Jesse Nathan, Aaron Peck, Donald Roberts, Orfeo Tagliori, and Mari Vick. And we wrote this poem together called Allowance. Children, your money is faceless, headless. It is running into a crumbling barn, unworth building back. Bless your hearts, our true blessings. You will need it and them as you bless the world's puddles into wishing wells and throw in your lot and peer in to look beyond your reflection. There, you will see bread lines grafted onto rose bushes. You will see straw spun in the whirlwind, illegible as broken teeth. You will see belief nestled like a root system, like a morbid, unyielding brain. The heirloom curse. We survive. That is how we survive our chain letter cosmos and overzealous sugar pills as appetite grows the belly. You were born needful and naked, and we still owe you everything. Here's one that I'm going to read two poems that are up now on the Brooklyn Rails website. It was just published, I think, as of yesterday. This first one, it's called Gold Given, Give of Fat, and it has two quotations, Gather, Girl, the Roses, which is disputed whether it's Ausonius or Virgil who wrote that, and then YOLO, which is anonymous. Gold given, give of fat, that giving back gives more than given, more than metal, loans abundance, the wasting blessing, wreathing bone and want to breed an interest, unlike seedless manna, unlike folding futures markets promises, a yield that firms, returning glut to glut and life, whatever life is meant to mean, count no one happy once they're dead, amassed and spent, outgrown and bare, reformed once more, in conjugation in this loose-bodied circulation, the windfall, ripe and rotting, freeborn to a sweet corruption, is resourced in full, subliming mind, pandemonic as creation, the universe of dust. And this other one that was published by the Rail just yesterday, it was originally put out in my friend Nan Golden's French catalog, exhibition catalog she had done, but the rail was really kind enough to take it as well, called The Sky's Portrait. Once, before light was domesticated and forgotten, I would pour out the shadow bath and seed the forest mind. There was a dark retreat in living off the land. The birds were mad with flight. My nursery still crowds with wind, my memory with colored earth, but in the mouth of time, it seems, all prayers melt to breath. Rivers tell the ice-clean truth of it. Everything intersects, root and branch, wolf and dog. The fat moon turns to sickle and back. A lack of windows is not a lack, is what is before it is a thing. I also appeared with the rail in response to a show here in Paris by David Novros, and it's called "No One is Tall to Heaven, No One is Large to the Land." The sky does not go missing when it grows into your eyes. Light makes a home, ready for history. You'd have found it all otherwise. So much indistinct air to build on, in, through breath. Here's one called Quarantine that I actually wrote 2 years before quarantine. So I'm thinking maybe I should start writing things about happy things to come and maybe, what is it, cast into the future that way. Rain on the sea, rain. Today, like always, like any other day, like any other day is another day, like any other day, before the end of quarantine. I've given up on counting. Patience is my only going to the end of quarantine. Today, like always, today copy paste. Today, the incontrovertible. Today the sump of time's parabola. Today. And what if I should stay to advertise a future, to grasp at an open hand, to be a fever to the fever, and to burn up with the effort? Then what then? The end of quarantine? Today's new, today's old. Today like a bottomless cup. Today, I've given up on counting. All is one and one and one and one. Not all we borrow from the world to come, and we are going. We don't know where we are going, but we know that we will. And I'd like to end with a poem that I really love by the poet Alice Oswald. If you don't know her work, you absolutely should go out and get a copy of any of her books, pretty much. This one's called Prayer. Here I work in the hollow of God's hand, with time bent round into my reach. I touch the circle of the earth. I throw and catch the sun and moon by turns into my mind. I sense the length of it from end to end. I sway me gently in my flesh, and each point of the process changes as I watch. The flowers come, the rain follows the wind. And all I ask is this, and you can see how far the soul, when it goes under flesh, is not a soul, is small and creature-ish, that every day the sun comes silently to set my hands to work, and that the moon turns and returns to meet me when it's done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was really beautiful. And thank you so much again to Phong and David. It's been such an honor. Really, really incredible conversation. I'd also like to give a shout out to Mike from Shambhala Publications for helping us out with coordinating this event. And as always, we'd like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and for their support of our growing archive, which you can check out on our YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and our public events like our daily NSC program. And this holiday season, we are working to sustain the work by raising $100,000 a month towards rail editors, writers, and operations. Your support will help keep our issues and events free, and you can donate. And please join us tomorrow for a conversation Quaitman and Felix Bernstein on the occasion of her show at Glenstone. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Crystal Languel. And finally, if you're free and in Brooklyn on Saturday, the Rail is having an amazing party at 5 p.m. in the Singing in Unison Part 7 space to help us ring in 2023. It's going to be a blast. So hope to see some of you there, and you should now be able to turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
David.
you.
Thanks, Phong.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
David.
Post,
Wow.
Jacob.
Thank you, Chloe and Eleanor.
Thank
That
you.
was amazing. Thank
Great
you.
reading, Jacob. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jacob.
Yes,
Very
to be
much.
continued. Part 2.
Thanks. Thanks
Yeah.
to the Rail for all this energy. It's really great.
Great to
Thanks.
see you, and congratulations. And do buy the book, you guys. Here's the book.
Yeah.
Jack.
Wild Mind, Wild Earth.
Right. Yep. Please
I'm
do.
getting a copy today.